Welcome to the conference. Big Questions is an event that is organized once a year by biblical student groups at universities. And usually it takes place on campus. But this year, since it's online, we collaborated with Lausanne, Geneva, and Fribourg. And it is about discussions about science and faith mostly, and also very difficult topics that are connected to the Christian faith. So today we have Tom Rizzo with us. So Tom Rizzo was born in New York, and he studied chemistry and did a PhD in physical chemistry. He has worked in this field ever since as a professor, and he was the dean at EPFL for 12 years for several subjects. He is married and has 2 children and 5 grandchildren, and he used to play basketball and enjoys skiing. He lived in Switzerland for 27 years, and as a professor, he received a number of awards and honors. And then I think, Tom, you can start.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. It's always a pleasure to give this kind of talk, and this evening to address an important question that one often hears on university campuses, and that is, are science and faith an impossible mix? Now, to set the stage for what I would like to say this evening, I'd like to start by telling you a story about my father. My father wasn't a scientist. In fact, he was a federal tax fraud investigator who worked in New York City. And one day when I was a teenager, he asked me to come to his office to meet his colleagues. Now, it was obvious to me why he did this. My father stood about 5 feet tall. He was about up to here. And he would always brag to his colleagues that he had a son that was a head taller than he was. And he basically just wanted to prove that he was telling the truth. So early one morning, I hopped onto the train with him for the long ride into New York City. And we had a normal conversation on the train. But when we arrived at his building, something seemed to change about my father. He carried himself a little bit differently. He used different language, somewhat coarse language that I'd never heard from him before. He really seemed like a different person. And while it didn't seem like he was trying to hide anything from me, it made me think of a CIA double agent who has to compartmentalize his life to keep his 2 identities separate. Now, does a scientist who believes in God have to compartmentalize his brain? Does one live one life in the laboratory during the week and then use a completely different part of one's brain on Sunday if one goes to church? Now, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been a scientist, a chemist for more than 45 years, and a Christian for about the same amount of time. And having thought about this subject for most of my career, I'm simply going to share with you some of my thoughts on it. Now, because I'm a chemist, I like to couch this question in chemical terms. Are science and faith immiscible? That is, are they insoluble? Are science and faith like oil and vinegar? You mix them together, and no matter how much you shake or stir them, they will separate? Or are they like water and alcohol? You mix them together, and you can't tell one from the other. Must a scientist compartmentalize his brain to believe in God? Must a Christian compartmentalize to do science? Now, there are many people who believe that the 2 represent incompatible worldviews, and maybe you fall into that category. Perhaps some of your professors at university have told you this. And one can even see it in the scientific literature. The prestigious journal Nature has a news and views section where they have articles related to science for the general public. And a few of these articles caught my eye. when Barack Obama was first elected president of the United States, he appointed Francis Collins as the head of the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest science funding body in the United States. As the article says, Francis Collins is one of the most accomplished scientists and scientific leaders of his generation. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, which has transformed modern medicine. And he's actually the boss of Anthony Fauci, whom we've all come to know over the last year. But in a subsequent article, there was controversy raised about his nomination to head the NIH. The controversy arose because of a book that he had published a few years earlier called The Language of God: A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. And this Nature article incited an animated exchange of articles in the subsequent issues of Nature. And I'd just like to read you a few excerpts from one subsequent article because it perfectly frames the question that I want to discuss today. It was called Balancing Belief in Bioscience. Can religious belief really be reconciled with a life of science? So let me just read you a few quotes from this. The recent nomination of Francis Collins to direct the US National Institutes of Health does more than raise the question of the agency's future direction. It poses another question. Can a scientific career go hand in hand with religious belief? Put in another way, can a great scientist be deeply religious? That's the question that we want to consider today. How rare is a dual practitioner such as Collins? In 1997, University of Georgia history professor Edward Larson and journalist Larry Witham reported survey results suggesting that 39% of scientists believe in God. But in a second survey, Larson and Witham asked a slightly different question. Do leading scientists have religious faith of equal measure to scientists in general? Using the members of the United States National Academy of Sciences for the so-called Greater Scientists group, they found that just 7% of respondents professed a belief in God. University of Oxford chemist Peter Atkins assessed the Larson and Witham survey in this way. You can clearly be a scientist and have religious beliefs, but I don't think you can be a real scientist in the deepest sense of the word, because they are such alien categories of knowledge. Now, that's one of the questions we want to address this evening. Is there any truth to this statement that science and religious faith are alien categories of knowledge? Are they completely orthogonal worldviews? Is the term religious scientist an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms? Now, when there's a conflict like this, often what happens is that each side creates a stereotype of the other side, a model in their mind of what the person on the other side of the argument is like. And then they criticize the stereotype. And as in any kind of stereotype, there's often some truth to it. And so what I'd like to do to address our question is first to explore how each side of the debate stereotypes one another. Now, while I consider myself both a Christian and a scientist, I'm going to take a step back from both and try to look at the situation objectively, criticizing each group where I feel is appropriate. So let's start by looking at some scientists' view of Christians. Christians are anti-scientific. Their faith is blind and irrational. They use the Bible as a scientific textbook to tell us things about the nature of the universe, such as the age of the earth. They use science to prove biblical texts. Now, in doing this, they're actually doing something that is not scientific, in my view. And let me explain what I mean. If we think about the scientific method, it starts by making observations, either observations from nature or measurements in the laboratory. And then one constructs some hypothesis or theory or model to account for all of these observations. Then one uses that model to make predictions for things that have not yet been observed. And then one tests those predictions by making additional measurements. One then asks, does the new data agree with the predictions? If the answer is yes, one goes back and tests it again. And then one is sort of in a loop where we're continually testing the model. Now, it turns out that most of the progress in science comes when the results don't agree with the theory, because then one has to modify the theory in such a way that it accounts for all of the previous observations as well as the new observations. And so the goal of much of what we do in science is actually to disprove theories rather than to prove things. And so when Christians try to use science to prove biblical texts, in my view, they're doing something that is fundamentally non-scientific. And finally, they put God in the gaps of science. There are many areas in science where our knowledge is incomplete. And if every time one finds a gap in science, one says, oh, that must be God who intervened and did something miraculous, then science will never progress. This kind of approach is actually an impediment to science. Okay, now how about some Christian stereotypes of scientists? Scientists are closed-minded atheists. They rule out God from the beginning by assuming that naturalism can explain everything. And they're biased in the practice of science. They skew their scientific results and their interpretation to demonstrate the foolishness of religion. Now, if you think this stereotype is totally unrealistic, look at this quote from Steven Weinberg, a Nobel laureate in physics, who says, "The world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization." Wow, that's a pretty strong statement, and it only gives credence to the stereotype. Now, in light of these stereotypes, and coming back to our central question, are science and faith an impossible mix? I'd like us to consider three other related questions. First, is the Christian worldview inherently anti-scientific? Next, is science completely devoid of faith? And third, is the Christian worldview based on blind faith? After having considered these questions, we'll be in a better position to consider whether science and faith are compatible. And then I'll close by setting out some challenges, both for Christians and for non-believing or secular scientists. Okay, so first, is the Christian worldview inherently anti-scientific? If you're any kind of student of history, you'd realize that Christianity was one of the engines that drove modern science. Driven by their belief in a rational God who created a structured universe, Christians were motivated to discover the rational order that was imposed upon it by God himself. One evidence of this is the role that Christianity has played in higher education. Some of the most elite institutions in the world had Christian origins. And I should say that that includes the universities of Lausanne and Geneva. And no one would claim that this group of scientists were not real scientists in the true sense of the word. Each of them publicly identified themselves as Christians, and some of them wrote extensively about it. Just to mention a few, Sir Francis Bacon was attributed with the development of the scientific method itself. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics. Isaac Newton, one of the giants of physics and the co-developer of calculus. Blaise Pascal, the famous mathematician. Antoine Lavoisier, the father of chemistry, and others who were giants in their field, many of whom won Nobel Prizes for their work. And I've just noted a few of the more recent ones here. Now, how can this be if the Christian worldview were inherently anti-scientific? That just doesn't make any sense. Second question, is science devoid of faith? Now, to address this point, we need to consider the definition of faith itself. What is the nature of faith? Webster's dictionary says, the firm belief in something for which there is no proof. Or if you prefer the Oxford Dictionary, strong belief in the doctrines of religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. Excuse me. And one has to be very careful about the whole question of proof in science, because in a sense, it's only mathematics that can really prove something, because it's based on a closed system of logic. And within that closed system, one can prove that something is self-consistent. But in science, we never really prove anything. Let me take you back to the scientific method that I mentioned earlier. You see, when we're in this loop where we have a model or theory that we use to make predictions, and we're doing more experiments to see whether they agree with our model, if everything agrees, we never exit from the loop. But what we're doing is building a body of evidence that allows us to trust or not to trust our theory. Or in other words, we're determining whether we can have faith in that theory, but we're not proving it. Tomorrow, there could be a result that we measure that disagrees with the theory. And so I contend that scientists exercise what I call evidence-based faith. And it's very logical to do that. Scientists also have faith in the rationality of the universe, the fact that the universe is comprehensible and rational. Albert Einstein had an interesting quote along these lines. He said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible." And then he goes on, "To this there also belongs the faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is comprehensible to reason. I cannot imagine a scientist without that profound faith." Now, we can't prove that the universe is rational and comprehensible. However, there's a huge body of evidence that tells us that it is. But we still have to take that on faith. But it's evidence-based faith. It's based on the body of evidence that the scientific community has collected. And finally, scientists have faith in the appropriateness of mathematics for describing the laws of the universe. Why does mathematics work so well for describing the laws of physics? Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize winner in physics and not a Christian, made the following comment. He said, "The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. We should be grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in future research, and that it will extend for better or for worse to our pleasure, even though perhaps also to our bafflement to wide branches of learning." Why does mathematics work for describing the laws of physics? We don't know. We can't prove that it should. But there's a huge body of evidence that suggests that it does work. And so we have faith in the appropriateness of mathematics. It's evidence-based faith. So scientific giants such as Einstein and Wigner, as well as the scientific method itself, would suggest that the answer to our question is no, science is not devoid of faith. Finally, the third question. Is the Christian worldview based on blind faith? Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, has been quoted as saying the following: "Faith is the great cop-out the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. Now, this is stereotyping at its worst. But the question is the Christian worldview based on blind faith, as Dawkins insists? Now, in this case, I think it's only fair to let the Bible itself tell us what the Christian worldview is based on, rather than deriving it from stereotypes or from Richard Dawkins. And I'm just going to read you a few short verses from the Bible, from the letter of the Apostle Paul to the Corinthian church. He wrote, "I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, on which you have taken your stand." What he's saying is this: I want to remind you on what you should base your faith. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and then he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. And then he goes on to say, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." He's basically saying, your faith is based on these events having happened, and this is on which you should take your stand. If they didn't happen, we are wasting our time, and so are you. Now, is this blind faith? I think it would only be blind faith if there were no evidence whatsoever that these events really happened. Now, as a young scientist, I was confronted by some Christians, and of all places, my chemistry class, about the claims of Christianity that Christ rose from the dead. And I was committed to following the evidence wherever it might lead, like any good scientist should. So what is the nature of the evidence? Well, it's basically historical evidence. It's like solving a cold case crime. And one of the exercises that I put myself through, being the skeptic that I was to say, if I wasn't willing to accept that the Bible itself was an authoritative source of information, what could I learn from critical sources, non-biblical sources such as Roman and Jewish historians? And I decided that the historicity of Jesus is well established by non-biblical sources, that he lived and that he died by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate. There are some people today who try to say that Jesus was just a myth, but I don't think that any intellectually honest historian would hold to that view. Now, another thing that is clear is that the resurrection was the primary message of the early church. The secular literature is clear about that. And this is what this group of people started saying right from the start. And one of the things that I found compelling is that the eyewitnesses of his death and resurrection were tortured and martyred for proclaiming this. Now, there are plenty of people today who are martyred for religious faith, but they're being martyred for something that someone else told them was true. These early followers of Jesus, they were tortured and martyred for what they claimed to have seen by their own eyes. Just think about something that you knew wasn't true. Would you be willing to be tortured and martyred for something that you knew was a lie? Is this blind faith? Now, different people need different amounts of evidence to convince them of something, but I think it would be unfair to say that the Christian worldview is based on blind faith. So where does this leave us in addressing our primary question, are science and faith an impossible mix? Is the Christian worldview inherently anti-scientific? Well, the history of science would say no. The Christian worldview is not anti-scientific. Is the practice of science devoid of faith? Well, giants such as Einstein and Wigner readily admit that the answer is no. Science is not devoid of faith. Is the Christian worldview based on blind faith? Well, the Bible itself would say no. The Christian worldview is not based on blind faith. Given all this, and putting aside the stereotypes, why would anyone think that science and faith are an impossible mix? Now, in light of my arguments this evening, which you may or may not agree with, let me issue a few challenges for both sides of the debate. I think we can all agree that both sides should be united in seeking truth. And seeking truth implies being willing to examine one's presuppositions. So first, some challenges for Christians. They should have no fear of science, no fear of the truth. If what one believes is true, one should have no fear of discovering the truth scientifically. They should have confidence in the scientific method, since by its nature, it's self-correcting. There's a wonderful story of Isaac Newton regarding his interpretation of the nature of light. Newton, during his lifetime, proposed that one could view light as little particles. But his interpretation was rejected in favor of the view that light could be described as a wave. And this sort of wrong interpretation of light existed for nearly 200 years until the self-correcting nature of scientific investigation led eventually to the true understanding, or the current understanding, that light can be viewed as either a particle or a wave. So this wrong interpretation, or the rejection of Newton's interpretation, persisted for 200 years, but the self-correcting nature of science eventually led to the right answer. And so one should have confidence in the scientific method to be self-correcting. Christians shouldn't insert God into the gaps of science. Instead, they should encourage the best scientists to do their best work to fill those gaps, even if those scientists don't share your beliefs. And then Christians should decide carefully on what to take your stand. One should learn from the case of the church and Galileo. Galileo provided evidence for the heliocentric view of the solar system rather than the geocentric view that came from the church's interpretation of the Bible. And because of this, he was excommunicated and put under house arrest. Now, if one were to take that position today, it would be silly. It would be like flat earthers. And it may mean that Christians might have to abandon the literal interpretation of certain biblical passages. One of the church fathers, Augustine, had some very good advice for Christians on this subject. He said, "In matters that are so obscure and far beyond our vision, we find in the Holy Scripture passages which can be interpreted in very different ways without prejudice to the faith we have received. In such cases, we should not rush in headlong and so firmly make our stand on one side that if further progress in the search for truth justly undermines this position, we too fall with it." I think that is wise advice that all Christians should take to heart. Now, a challenge for scientists. Recognize the degree of faith that's inherent in science, the rationality of the universe, the adequacy of mathematics, and even the basic scientific method itself. Now, while Christians are sometimes guilty of putting God in the gaps of science, scientists are sometimes guilty of ignoring the gaps when they should investigate them. And one subject area where this is of particular interest to me as a chemist is that of molecular evolution or prebiotic chemistry. If you talk to a biologist about evolution, of course, the starting point for their discussion is self-reproducing organisms, or at least self-reproducing molecules on which the forces of natural selection can take effect. But if you ask them, well, where did these, or how did these self-reproducing molecules come about? They'll say, well, that's the domain of chemistry. And we're confident that the chemists understand it or will understand it. But if I go to my chemistry colleagues and ask them, how did self-reproducing molecules come about? To a large extent, they haven't really a clue. There's really no solidly accepted explanation for this. And so I think it's a little bit dishonest for a biologist to skip over these gaps rather than insist that we investigate them and understand fully how self-reproducing molecules might come about. Rather than dismissing the Christian worldview based on a stereotype of blind faith, scientists should be willing to examine the evidence and follow it wherever it may lead, like any good scientist should. And then finally, scientists need to recognize that science alone may not be able to address questions of meaning and purpose. Roger Wolcott Sperry, a Nobel laureate and a neurobiologist, is quoted as saying, "The meaning of the message will not be found in the physics and the chemistry of the paper and ink." And finally, a closing thought which summarizes my position on the subject before I take questions. I'd like to read you a quote from Max Planck in his lecture on religion and science. He said, "It is the steady, ongoing, never slackening fight against skepticism and dogmatism, against unbelief and superstition, which religion and science wage together." Well, that's all I have to say this evening. I hope that it may have helped some of you see things in a slightly different way.
Thank you so much, Tom. This is how you can reach us or stay connected to us. So on the Instagram page, you can also find testimony videos. So where other Christians share their story, how they came to a belief in God. And we have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is actually also for the videos. And you can also contact us via email.